Hey guys, it's Jalen, and I'm here with another episode of Recent Reads. This is the series where I just chat about the last 10 books that I read. It's pretty chill. I like to keep a log of what I've read. I'm so behind on, honestly, just all of YouTube. I have not had the chance to script anything, film anything in months, but I had a little moment today, and I am honestly so behind on these videos. I have one waiting to post that I haven't edited from months ago, and I'm like 7 books into the next one after this. As always, my little disclaimer is that these are my very subjective opinions. The numerical rating that I give is kind of pointless. I've even thought about doing away with it because I don't even really believe on like assigning numerical value to work. It's not meant to be anything objective. I really just keep them up there because people have said that they like them. I guess to just get like a good sense of how much I enjoyed the book. But you know, obviously sometimes they might talk about the craft and stuff, and I think that's really important, and that's a huge part of why I make these videos, is to talk about the craft and what I can learn from all these different books. But the point of this series is definitely not to kind of assign value to these works or to these authors, or say that certain works are worth more or are more valuable. They're all valuable. My opinion as an individual doesn't really mean anything. In the grand scheme of things, it really is just how I felt as I read these books and trying to put into words why I felt the way that I felt. That's to say, there's kind of no method to the madness. Let's jump into the books. So the first book that I read was The Daughters of Izdihar by Hadeer Elsbai. This is a fantasy book. I have been reading a little more fantasy. It's something that I've been introducing more into my reading over the past few years. This one really caught my attention for being like a feminist sapphic fantasy book set in an Egypt-inspired setting. I was like, say no more. We're set in an Egypt-inspired fantasy world with elemental magic, and so we follow these two different characters. One of them, Nuttall, her goal is to attend this water weaving academy, but her family cannot afford to send her. She marries this kind of wealthy merchant. The deal is basically that then he will pay for her to go to this magical academy. And then we also follow Georgina, who is the woman that he's in love with. She's a bookseller. She's involved in this kind of like feminist movement. This was quite easy to read as fantasy goes. Like, I found it really sped by quite easily. I didn't feel there was much of a learning curve. Like, I felt very acquainted with the world very immediately. Like, it didn't really feel like, it felt real and lived in, but it didn't feel vast or like there was really much of a wrapping my mind around things, orienting myself, which I personally enjoyed as someone who's not a big fantasy reader. I thought this was very approachable, and I also just thought it was cool to have a fantasy book that was centered around like a feminist movement. Also a cute sapphic romance. It happened in a very compressed part of the book. I was like reading this one evening, and I was texting my girlfriend, and I was like, oh yeah, I picked this up because it was marketed as like a sapphic fantasy book, but I don't know if it's even going to go that way, just because I've picked up so many fantasy books that are supposedly sapphic and then they aren't. And I was like halfway through the book at that point, and then immediately as I said that, suddenly got a sapphic romance, and I was like, oh my god, never mind, I take back what I said, it is super sapphic. And then 30 pages later, that plot thread had kind of wrapped up. So the pacing of that was a little strange. One POV character here felt inconsequential. Like, we have two main characters, Nuttall and Georgina. Georgina just felt forgotten. I found Nuttall more interesting. I found her story more interesting. She was much more favored by the narrative. It almost just felt like it should have just been her story. Georgina just felt very tacked on. There were a lot of points where I was like, what's going on with Georgina? I completely forgot about her. Oh, nothing really. I think the writing here felt very young adult. And I don't mean that as a bad thing. I don't like it when people use young adult as like an insult, because there's nothing bad about young adult. It's just a different style written for a different target audience. I don't know, stylistically, in just the quickness of the prose, I didn't dislike that, but it also kind of took off an edge of seriousness for me from the narrative. To me, this kind of felt in between. This almost felt new adult. I mean, I think it's adult and the characters are adults, but it felt kind of like an adult fantasy book told stylistically like a young adult one. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just to say that if you like a really... Oh, the cat is screaming. Ignore him. That if you like a really mature feeling, rich, kind of archaic even feeling fantasy book, you may not enjoy this. However, If you really like young adult fantasy and you're trying to move into adult fantasy, or you are looking for an adult fantasy book that kind of is written the way a YA fantasy book would be, I think this actually would check a box for a lot of people who are basically looking for a book written for adults and marketed for adults and that is thematically for adults, but stylistically is written in more of a YA style. And I believe the second book comes out fairly soon. Then I read Lioness by Emily Perkins. So this book follows a woman named Therese who's kind of living this easy life of luxury because her husband is quite wealthy, but then he ends up in like a business scandal. And then she just develops this kind of weird relationship with the woman in the flat below her. I don't have much to say about this book. I will say, first of all, Emily Perkins can write. Like, she can absolutely write. The sentences were delicious, but I was never compelled by the story at any point. The story almost, felt actively boring. I will sometimes enjoy a book where the writing is just gorgeous because I love gorgeous language. Like, for a lot of readers, I know that's not enough, but for me, sometimes that can be enough. In this book, it almost felt like the story was just so dull. It was just privileged people hanging out doing nothing. The conflict was almost just kind of spiritual in a sense, but it didn't really have much pull to me. Ultimately, I felt quite bored by this, although there were some really nice passages of character-driven prose. Then I read Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead by Emily Austen. You guys have been recommending this book to me for years, and it's one of those ones that I keep saying, I'm gonna pick that up next, I'm gonna pick that one up next, and for some reason I don't, and I don't know why. It's one of those books that feels like it was written for me, and you guys were right, okay? You were all right, everyone who told me to read this. So this book follows a woman named Gilda. She is anxiety-ridden and can't stop thinking about death, and she is also an atheist lesbian, but she ends up kind of through a accident, faux pas, working as the secretary in a Catholic church. So she ends up kind of living this double life and having to kind of hide her queerness. It ends up going to wilder places than I was really expecting, actually. I thought this was just hilarious and human. I was laughing out loud at passages. There were some hilariously relatable passages and moments. If you're an anxious lesbian, then this was written for us, actually. Finally. It really perfectly captured this spiral of anxiety and limbo and overthinking. Like, it was just real. It was so real. The scene structure was really short, and it created this really, really fast pace that I overall really enjoyed. I love a brisk pace, and I found it really effective with the style here. But it also meant that sometimes we seemed to cut important moments short or cut certain threads a little short, and I just wanted them to be played out just a tiny bit more. But I really, really enjoyed this, and I believe she just had a new book come out, and I can't wait to read it. So then I read Tauhou by Kōtuku, Titihuia, Nuttall. So this is an experimental novel that combines like prose, poetry, memoir, all of the forms to explore a bunch of different characters and vignettes set in an alternate reality where Vancouver Island and New Zealand sit side by side in the ocean, and the Maori and Coast Salish cultures have like a shared history and shared culture. And it's about like indigeneity and motherhood and community and like healing from colonialism. I thought this was a perplexing little book. Very poetic. It kind of feels like the whole book is a poem in a sense. Perplexing, but I enjoyed it. I couldn't really grasp, or not couldn't, but it was difficult to grasp an overall narrative. I think that was more just thematic. But I also don't think having an overall narrative was really the point of this book. I think it was more of an exploration rather than like a clean narrative arc, and I think in that respect it was very effective. It's the kind of book that you just kind of go with. Like, you gotta just roll with it. It's not conventional. There's no blueprint telling you how to read this. You have to just go with it and enjoy it piece by piece. Glean all the little insights that you can glean. Collage, mosaic, almost more than a novel. Somewhere between novel, memoir, essay collection, short story collection, and poem. But it worked for me. The next book is one I'm really excited to talk about. This may have been one of my favorite books of 2023, and it's Idlewild by James Frankie Thomas. I was seeing just glowing reviews for this everywhere I looked. So this book is set in the early 2000s at a Quaker high school, and we follow two characters, and we're introduced to them years later in their adulthood, and we know that they had a falling out and they were really only friends for this 1 year. We then kind of explore this friendship, this extremely intense friendship that they had. One of the characters, Nell, is an openly lesbian teenager, and this other character, Faye, is kind of this mysterious figure who is obsessed with gay men. And I wouldn't say that this is a spoiler because I think it's quite obvious, but we're basically reading a character who is a closeted gay trans man, but just doesn't know it yet throughout the events of the book. I think that's not really a spoiler to say because I think it's quite obvious to the reader, but just not to this character yet. I thought that this was funny, weird, fascinating, perceptive story about queer friendships. This was one of the best, if not the best, execution of a book on complicated / messy queerness that I have read. I felt like it acknowledged and explored a level of complexity on queerness that I've been searching for in books. The way that these characters' very different experiences of queerness built these very complicated, messy levels of resentment in their friendship, I thought was so interesting and so fascinating. The friendship just felt so lived in, so real. It was heartfelt and tragic, but the book was also hilarious. There's a whole plot point of these two characters writing /fic of two of their classmates on their live journal. Like, it's very 2000s chronically online. This is like the complicated, messy, queer read that I've been looking for. If you, like me, have been looking for a book that really looks at gender and queerness and sexuality in the context of friendship and in a really messy, complicated, nuanced way, then I couldn't recommend this one enough. Aside from just how well those themes were tackled, I thought it was incredibly engaging, exciting, really well written, really human novel. Just really, really, really fantastically executed. Then I read Organ Meats by Ming Chang. You knew I'd be reading this because you know I'm a huge Ming Chang fangirl. This book follows two girls, Anita and Rainey. They basically start pretending to be dogs, kind of. It's a lot to explain. It's a lot to explain. And it's also about, like, weird queer friendships, as I would expect from Ming Chang. It's just wild, crazy, funky, unique. In very classic Ming Chang style, it feels like every single sentence is a revelation. There's not one sentence in here that doesn't feel brilliant and unprecedented, and she does that in all of her work, and it really never ceases to amaze me. Of all her published books, this is probably my least favorite, although I think it's still like a triumph. I think because I sometimes got lost in the density of ideas. Like, there's almost an unprecedented idea on every sentence. And so I think I just kind of sometimes felt like there were so many individual thoughts that were all really compelling, but I didn't always see how these really compelling little thoughts were contributing to an overall narrative. So I almost enjoyed this more on a sentence level, but sometimes I felt like those sentences didn't tie together in a way that, like, necessarily built upon each other. I still really enjoyed this. It's super wacky and visceral. It's also very funny. I think one thing I always forget about Ming Chang's work whenever I pick it up is how funny it is. Then I read Ghost Music by An Yu. So this book follows a piano teacher in Beijing, and she really wants to have a child, but her husband doesn't want to, and they have a weird relationship, and then his mother moves into the apartment. And then she starts having these weird dreams, and someone starts sending her mushrooms in the mail, and she kind of follows this strange mail and mushrooms she keeps getting to look for this famous pianist. There's a lot going on. On the page, it kind of feels simple and cohesive. It's poetic and kind of like a song of itself. It's kind of this reflective character study with this weird dash of fabulism. You know, it's lonely and quiet and unassuming, but it's a little bit surreal too. A very quick read. I think I read this in just 1 or 2 days. It's the kind of book that you just kind of flow through very easily. There's like a tenderness to it. There's a lot of very bizarre elements happening all at once, but they all really, I felt, worked together quite cohesively. So then I read Mudflowers by Aley Waterman. So this book follows a young woman who moves into an artsy community in Toronto. She has a best friend named Alex, and the two of them have kind of an ongoing, slightly romantic, sexual, platonic, weird relationship. And then she starts becoming very intrigued with this poet named Maggie, and they start dating. and it's just about this weird triangle of relationships that she finds herself in. The writing is beautiful, it's so insightful, it's so real and like every observation is so real and human. Like, it was such a human, tender narrative. Like, human is really the first word that comes to mind when I think about this. I thought the start was so strong. Like, the first third, I thought I was looking at a 5-star read. I couldn't put it down. I thought it was gorgeous, and I just felt this connection to the story immediately. But I just felt like after that it really lost direction and focus in terms of story, and as a result, the insightfulness of the narrative also kind of lost its impact as well. At a lower rating, but I did really enjoy this, and I think if you like this type of book, wandering, aimless young person, then I still would really recommend it because the writing is so connected, you know, to kind of the human experience, and I just thought that that was very beautiful and understated and real. Then I read Mrs. S by Kay Patrick. So this book follows a butch lesbian from Australia who moves to an kind of elite English boarding school to work as the matron. You know, there's this immediate class difference between her and all of the girls who are, you know, from very wealthy families. And then she meets Mrs. S, who is the headmaster's wife, and the two of them begin an affair. This was extremely unique. The style of this was so unique. It's this punchy, weirdly rhythmic that really heightens the emotions. The story is very kind of quiet and languid. It also feels very intense at the same time. I think the style really captures this sense of like repressed but also like bursting forth desire that really beautifully echoes the relationships happening on the page. I thought this was a great example of like unity of style and concept. Like the way the sentences were created, I felt really matched the emotions and the arc of the story. I'm really excited to read more from this author. So the final book that I read was Sambac Beneath Unlikely Skies by Heba Hayek. So this is just kind of a series of vignettes about like youth and girlhood growing up in Gaza. Each vignette is also inspired by a song. Each vignette here just pops very quietly. Like, it's not a linear book, it's not really a traditional novel. It's just these tiny little moments, and most of them are very quiet. Some of them are quite intense, but a lot of them are just very quiet, but they all pop. Like, each one really pops on the page. I found this book because it was being talked about because of the genocide that's happening in Palestine right now. This is an excellent novel, and it's fantastic to support Palestinian authors, and it's, you know, great that a lot of Palestinian authors are getting a lot of support right now, and they should be. Art and writing and poetry is like a beautiful form of resistance that we should absolutely be engaging with, but I do think that it's also important to remember that reading books will not bring back lives. Just reading Palestinian authors is fantastic, but it's not going to stop this genocide from happening. So call your reps, contact your reps, keep protesting. It's great to support these authors, but that's really not enough. I just wanted to take a quick moment in this video to recommend a few other Palestinian books. A few of these I read a really long time ago, and so they're not in this video. And a few of them will be coming up in the next episode of Recent Reads. First of all is Salt Houses by Hala Alian. This one I read a really long time ago, and so I don't remember it too well, but I do remember really enjoying it. It's a family saga about a Palestinian family. Each chapter follows, you know, a different character, and so you get this kind of, you know, multi-generational saga kind of structure. There's another book out that I haven't read, and she also has a poetry collection that I haven't read, but I have read some of her online poetry, and it's incredible. So if you're in a poetry mood, I think she would be a great author to check out. Next is You Exist Too Much by Zaina Arafat. I also read this quite a while ago. Whatever year I read this, it was one of my favorite books of the year, like top 3 of the year. This book follows a Palestinian American woman, and it's very non-linear and floaty, and so we follow a bunch of different relationships she's had. She's bisexual, and so we follow kind of a bunch of different romantic relationships she's had with both men and women. One of the timelines, she's being treated for a love addiction, and at the core of it, though, it's really about her relationship with her mother, and it's just a really intimate portrait of this character, and it's very, like, effortlessly meandery in structure. I really, really enjoyed it. Like, 5-star, cannot recommend enough. Next up is Minor Detail by Adania Shibley. I'll be talking about this one in the next episode of Recent Reads. This is a little novella, like you could literally read it in an hour. I think I read it in an hour. It's kind of set in 2 parts. In the first part, an Israeli soldier and, well, a group of Israeli soldiers assault a Bedouin girl, and then in the second half we see a Palestinian woman. She comes across this story and she's struck by very violent event had taken place on her birthday. And so she sets out to learn everything she can about this girl. It's just a really, like, brutal but incredible portrait of life under Israeli occupation. The ending, if you have read this, you know, the ending of this, like, shook me. Next is The Skin and Its Girl by Sarah Cipher. I also just read this, so it'll be in the next episode of Recent Reads as well. I think this is a pretty new release. This is kind of like a magical realist story about a girl who is born to a Palestinian family in the PNW, and she's born with blue skin. And on the same day of her birth, her family's soap factory, the family was known for making this very famous blue soap. Their factory was in Nablus, is destroyed in an Israeli airstrike. And it's just one of the most beautiful, like, well-written books that I've read in a really long time. The writing is absolutely incredible, and, you know, we follow different generations of women in this family. It's kind of about their family secrets and queerness. It's really, really beautiful. Like, one of the most well-written books. Like, every sentence was gorgeous. And then just a couple others that I haven't read. First is The Coin by Yasmin Zahar. So I haven't read this because it's not out yet. I think it comes out in the summer later this year, but it just looks really, really interesting. And there's something about pyramid schemes. I'm not really sure exactly what it's about, but I've seen really, really good reviews. And then the last one I want to talk about is The Stone House by Tara Hawari. So this is from the same press that did Sambac Beneath Unlikely Skies, and since that book is a little difficult to get your hands on, it's a little bit of a niche title just because it's quite a small press. I think you can only order it directly from the press, at least that's what I did, and it is a UK press, so if you're in the UK, they're probably more accessible books. I also don't remember exactly what it's about, but I just do know that it's set in Palestine by a Palestinian author. So yeah, I just wanted to share these books since I know it's probably the title of this video, like supporting Palestinian books or authors, but I was only talking about one in the video, so I just wanted to take a moment to talk about some books that either are, you know, way in the archives of Recent Reads, but are fantastic and that I wanted to share, or that are just coming up in the next video. So they'll have, I'll talk a little bit more in depth about Minor Detail and The Skin and Its Girl soon. And I'll also leave in the description some more resources to learn about Palestine, the genocide happening there, and also some resources on places that you can donate or, you know, find protests near you, so that we can all keep, you know, fighting for a free Palestine. So that is all that I have for this episode of Recent Reads. I literally haven't even posted the previous one, and I'm 7 books in to the next one. But I've just been not having the time to do anything related to YouTube lately. My question for this video is, I just love to know what your most anticipated books of 2024 are. I like to keep a big tally, a big list of all the books that I'm excited for that are coming out in a given year, and I will add to it based on your suggestions. So that's all for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!